Okay, so this is going to be a run through of the content for Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, we talk about um, the next level of logical functions, so complex logical and retrieval functions. All right, so we'll be looking at things like um, the different ways we can do searches of tables and some of the logical functions we can bring in that can drive logic. Right now, some of the stuff we're going to talk about, the use of if functions, all right, um, the kind of how we can leverage them, how we can make more complicated. We take simple if functions and we can turn them into complicated ones, and then we kind of you know make multiple levels of these things. So as we ultimately get out to fully nested if functions, different layers. Um, Go back and we'll take a look at lookup functions. We had looked at this earlier, but there's some additional stuff that's in the lookup function that we want to explore. All right, and then also some of the additional functions that can help us retrieve data in a worksheet. So it's going to be the match index and indirect function, and finally the error capture if error function. All right, so we'll look at that and kind of look through the different capabilities of that. Okay, so let's start off with the if function. Right, it's a very simple, very simple logical function. We ask a question. All right, so this is we evaluate something, and then based upon the result of that evaluation, we choose a path. All right, that's it. And it's in a nutshell. If we look at the way it's structured, it's if logical test, then here's our true value, and here's our false value. All right, so if we say if the value in C5 is less than or equal to 0, you're a scratch golfer. All right. Otherwise, you're a handicapped golfer, right? And this is a representation. This is what we call a decision tree. So this is really a pictorial representation. We can use these things as we're designing this logic. All right. So this is, the thing that's important as we look at the execution of this function, the positions of the arguments. So the logical test is first. The true value is second. The false value is third. All right, so it's three arguments. Okay, so as we take a look, this is kind of an example. If we look at the example of this is, if a particular value is set in a particular cell, it'll put different, it will put a different response, either yes, or positive or negative. All right, so we've got a couple different ways. I mean, it's a very common. The if function is a very common function. All right, very used extensively when as we're developing formulas, because it really does allow us to drive logic. All right, now the challenge is that as we start combining these things, the formulas can get confusing, all right, because there's a lot of, so you have to kind of keep things. The challenge, and a lot of times as we're constructing these formulas, is trying to keep things straight. What get executed first, second, third. So the idea is, the innermost function will get executed first, and then the outer function, and then it'll, the results of that will be passed back to the next function. The results of that will be passed back to the next function, and so on and so forth, however many functions we have. All right. So we can, so in its simplest form, we have a single logical test. All right. If something is equal to something, if something is greater than something, if something is not equal to something. All right. But we can add additional logic in on this. All right, so we can put multiple logical tests. So this is where we talk about the these different kinds of link or join functions, or formulas. All right, so what we look at was going to be an and, an or, and a not. All right, so this is like, if something is not equal to something, or if something is equal to something and something else is there, or or something is equal to something or something. All right. So the logical test. This is the logic we look here. We can build very complicated and sophisticated logic structures. All right. Now the problem is making sure that we organize it in such a way so that we get the correct answer. All right. So in English we'll say X and Y. All right? And so what we would see is, in English we would call something as X and Y. In Excel, it would be, we do an and. All right, so we feed it as an and then the two values. If X and Y are both true. All right, so logical 1, logical 2. Same thing with an or. So logical, is this logical true or is it false? Or a not, which is the opposite. So it would be any value, but that value is equal to a not. All right. So if we look at the way we would represent, say, logic, looking for kind of a combination of the ACT and somebody with a GPA of 3.5, it would be represented as an and. ACT greater than or equal to 30, GPA greater than or equal to 3.5. All right, and what will happen is both of these values have to be true in order for it to be true. If they're not true, if either of these are incorrect, all right, it will fail. We will return a false. This is all Boolean. The term we use in the computing world is Boolean logic. Right? And this is actually pretty fundamental to how processors are set up. If you kind of dive into the processor on your computer, it's really a bunch of ultimately as you go down to the atomic, because processors are now getting down to the getting closer to the atomic level. What they are really switches, and with the logic gate of if, and, or, nor, that drive logic. All right, so switches when there's either a 1 or a 0. All right, so this is the implementation of that within Excel. All right, so we have two sets. This is our and an or. All right. Now, this particular slide is incorrect. All right. So the logic here is some of it's the top part is correct. So if I do an and an and, if it's true and true, the result is a true. All right. If it's true and a false, the result is false, because both are not true. A false and a true is false, and a false and a false are false. All right, so that's what So that's what we would get. The logic here, though, on the or, this is an incorrect slide. It's in the book. A logical test A, if A or B is true, it's true. If A is true and B is false, it's still true because it's an or function. All right. And the same thing with if A is false and B is true. All right. And then finally, the final case is if both are false, which is so if it's either, if neither are true, then we show up with a false. So this is kind of the inverse. So it's true, false, 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 and false. Excuse me. True, 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 false. All right. So we can start combining these things together. We can, construct logic within our worksheet that lets us do all sorts of interesting stuff. All right. So the way this gets shown up, the way this shows up is if we do an and, we do an if. All right. We're saying if the value. Remember the way of an if statement is really three arguments. All right. First argument is the logical test. This is what you do if it's true. This is what we do if it's false. All right. In this case, my logical test consists of two logical tests. All right. B4 has to be equal to assistant manager, and B9 has to be greater than 0.25. All right. If it's true, we get a response of on target. If it's false, we get a we return an indication of increased sales. All right. Both of these have to be true in order for the AND condition to work. All right. If we look at our next example here, an OR. All right. So what we're saying here is an OR condition is if F9, and this is obviously, as we've talked about, this is an absolute address. So if F9 is equal to this value, whatever the value is in that absolute address, or if F9 is equal to the value in this absolute address, or we'll do non-local. All right, so if either of those conditions are met, we'll do this. Otherwise, it'll return a false, and this is going to be our false indication. Okay. The idea behind a not is the opposite. All right. So the way we read this would be if it's anything but. If I9 is anything but accessories, so if I9 is not accessories, we call it a big ticket item. Otherwise, we return a blank. All right, so we can blank out the cell. All right, so what you can do is you can use this logic here if you're, kind of going through and identifying, going through a list of items and trying to figure out, okay, which ones have certain values and certain tags you want to put on them. So, if it's rather than have to check if it's this and this or this or this or this or this, you go the opposite way. You say, okay, so long as it's not accessories, you call it a big ticket. Now, as we start looking at this, we start getting, the logic starts getting really kind of crazy trying to sort this out. So the thing is, you really have to kind of deconstruct these things. All right. So what we want to do is we're saying there's two conditions that have to be met. Okay. So it's either going to be, so the logic is, and we'll do our, kind of our first logic here, if it's sell high or ultra, right, and it's sell morning or afternoon, return a 1. Otherwise, return a 0. All right, so it's really kind of looking at this and kind of breaking this into all these functions, because it's all these, each function will execute separate, independently, execute on its own. All right, and then what it'll do is it'll pass that logic back to the next to the next function, and so on and so forth. So it goes to the lowest level, and then works your way back up to the outside level, to the top level. All right, so we can integrate complex. We can do some pretty complicated stuff here. All right, we can combine ands and ors. An or function inside and function inside an or function. Other combinations of these, and we can string a lot of this stuff together. So keeping track of this becomes the big challenge, right? And a lot of times we'll look at this. You look at something like this, and it becomes very, this if statement here, really intimidating. Trying to sort the logic out. So it's all about, it's each function executes independently of the other ones, and they're all kind of combined together. All right. So the tool we use, we call the T-chart method. So the T-chart method is really just a way of visualizing what logic looks like. All right. So in this case, what we have is we're going to check a combination of conditions. All right, so we're going to see if it's a promotional item, or or the gross revenue is greater than 100. All right, so that's one condition we have. If either of those are true, and club member is equal to yes, this will be our value. Otherwise, this will be our value. We will return a 0 if false. All right. So what will happen is this will be the inner OR. This would be the AND would be on the outside. The OR would be on the inside. All right. So you have an OR with this value and this value. All right. And then that would be combined with the AND, to evaluate this this logic, and then the result of this OR function. And so, like I said, it's kind of a it takes some practice to really get comfortable with this. So it's if you're looking at it and you think it looks crazy, it is at first glance, all right, but it does make sense. And like I said, the more you look at it and the kind of more practice you get with it, you can kind of start figuring, you should be able to, we can work your way through this stuff. Excuse me. So this is, kind of a, just the example of an AND and an OR kind of combined together, a nested OR inside of an AND function. All right. Another example. This is the inverse. All right. So what we're checking for, we're going to check to see, if both these values are true. All right. Or, so if both these values are true, or if it's a promo item, we'll give it the outcome of 10%. Otherwise, we do we use a 0%. All right. So this is a so as we get more sophisticated with with working with functions and ands and ors and all this logical stuff, we really have to sit down and kind of map this stuff out carefully, to get it, so it operates the way we want it to operate. All right. So, and here's and on top of that, including the ands and ors, we can nest if statements. All right. So we can say, in the case here, if something is between 0 and 25, it'll be a beginner. Something between 25 and 40 is proficient. Anything greater than 40 is an expert. All right, so we look at this pictorially. This is so it's a range. We define this range, and this range. And the way we can implement this is through a set of nested if statements. All right. So the function we would look at would be an if, if c equal 14 is an expert. So actually, the way we would do this is actually we can use, instead of just simply using an IFS, an I function, an IF function, if function, we can use an IFS. Now you could also go back and actually build nested ifs, instances, but that becomes really, really messy. So one of the things they've done within Excel, within the logic processing, they've created, a function called IFS. And what an IFS function is it enables us to put multiple values in. So you say if it's, greater than 40, we call it an expert. If it's greater than 25, it's proficient, and otherwise it's a beginner. All right. So what happens is the sequence of this is really kind of the trick on this. All right. So the logic is, first we're going to see if it's greater than 40. All right. If it's not greater than 40, we'll check the next one. Next one is going to be, okay, is it greater than 25? Because if it's not greater than 40, then it will be, between 25, and we check to see if it's between 25 and 40. And if it's not between 25 and 40, then it has to be less than 25. All right, so that's that's kind of this logic. And the way this is constructed, this is what we call the IFS function. So it's an IFS, we use IFS, and then in parens we put our qualifiers in here. All right, so it's an expert, else. In programming logic, when we're working with program, with I would say honest to goodness programs, but we're working with programming languages. What this would be represented by an if, then, else. So if it's this, do something, otherwise do something else. Otherwise do something else. So you can do an if, then, else, as a logic construct. All right? So this is kind of Excel's way of being able to do something like that. All right, this is kind of a representation of this nested function. All right. So we have an AND function. You have to be a member, and if it's an and the value is high, or if you're a member and the value is high, you get 20% off. Otherwise, if the value is high, you get 15% off, and if it's not those two cases, then you only get 10% off. All right, so how we construct this logic is is we kind of execute the first test, look at the results, execute the second test, look at the results, and then if it's not that, it has to be the third. Right? So let's look at the lookup functions. Right? So we talked about searching, and the idea of we create a table, in a range of cells. Right? So we define, here's our starting point, here's our ending point, or we can use a named range, either way. All right. And the way lookup works is we give it a value. So it's a function. We give it a value, and it will look in, and we give it the value and the table name. And then what it will do is it will give us, it'll look to match the value. And if it finds it in the table, it will return it will return that value. All right. Two types of lookups. All right. And, this relates back to kind of Excel. We can either do a vertical, so we would create our table as a vertical set of vertical set of cells. All right, two columns of cells. All right, that's what we call VLOOKUP. An HLOOKUP is when those comparison values are in a row horizontally. All right, so there's two different ways of executing this. I think VLOOKUP is lookup defaults back. I think it's the older function. I believe it will. I'm not sure if it defaults to VLOOKUP. I'm not sure exactly what what it is, but the VLOOKUP, now what the expectation is when you're using a table, you will define kind of the structure of the table. Is it a vertical alignment or is it a horizontal alignment? Okay. Example of VLOOKUP. So this is a two-column table. This is our simple, because this is kind of our simple implementation. All right. VLOOKUP. We give it a lookup value. We give it the array. So this would be whatever the value or the cell that has the value we want to do the lookup one. The table array can either be a cell range. So here's our starting point. Here's our ending point. Or we define that range of cells as a named range, and it will find it. All right. By default, there's two ways we can execute the VLOOKUP or the HLOOKUP. One is going to be, we have a two-column table. All right. So a two-column basically indicates that it's one column has the key, the other column has the value. All right, they're kind of next to each other. That is one way to do it. So those would be two. They would have two arguments on that. Another way we can do it is we have those first two arguments. We add a third argument, and what we do is we use this. We can use this variant of the VLOOKUP to do some slick stuff. Like, for example, if I have a column that if I have a table with multiple columns in it, let's say I got 5 columns. What I can do is I can put a number in here that matches the number of the column in the table. So if there's 5 in there, the 5th one, we put a 5. If it's what we want to pull is the 4th one, 4, so on and so forth. All right, and then what it'll do is it'll return that, it'll go to that field or that value, that cell in that column. All right, so this is a simple, this is kind of the simple example here. Belgian waffles, $3.90, $3.49, biscuits and gravy, a breakfast menu. We give it the lookup value. It returns column, the data that's in column 2. All right, and as I said, we can make this slicker in that we can create a multi-column table, do our lookup, and then pick, identify what value in what column we want to return. Horizontal lookup is the sideways implementation of a lookup. So, in the construction here, it works it'll be a horizontal range of data. So we'll search the horizontal, the top row, which will be which will have our search values in it. And then the lines below will have what row. So it's the inverse of it. So it would be it would be the column. The columns and the rows, basically work the same way. You can say, okay, what row do I pull the data from, as opposed to what column do I pull it from. All right. Now, we've got some additional stuff we can use to do lookups on data. So we can use, we can retrieve data, and we have match, index, and indirect functions. All right. So the idea is, once again, we define a range of data, we give a value, and then it looks for a result, something that matches that, and we'll return the result, the execution of the match. If it finds it, it'll bring back the result. All right. So in this case, our lookup value is in whatever's in F23. And what we do is we match this up through an array. And if it matches, it'll return the result. Now, in this case right here, this is a range, but once again, can also be used as a named range. And one of the things you might want to start thinking about is, as you're creating tables and doing table lookups, the named range is but it is easier to kind of follow, because right now what you have to do is, you look at you kind of look at this. It's an absolute value. It's a table defined with absolute values, the starting point and the ending point. So you can look at the worksheet and look at it. But if you give it a name range, if you assign a name to it, then it becomes easier to kind of understand what's going on with it. All right. So that's our match value. All right, the match function will tell us what column number something is in. All right. Indexes are similar. It returns the value of the element in a table and array selected by the row and the column number indexes. All right, so the idea is, kind of a similar fashion. We give it an array, we give it the row number, or the row and the column number, and it will come back with that value. So we'll do, here's our value. Go to this cell in this table and bring back, and return that result. All right. And then indirect is another kind of a one. I want to say the one-off is that isn't a particularly the indirect is not a particularly common utilization, but it's something it's in it. We can use it. There's circumstances when this would be the right tool to use. And what we can use the indirect function is we can change the text string within a cell to a cell reference. All right, so we can do something along the lines of we can combine an indirect. We can do a VLOOKUP, and then we can use an indirect. By using a combination of the match and the indirect, we can effect a VLOOKUP to find data within within a table. Now, as I said, one of the things about this stuff, especially with the Boolean logic and the search logic, as we get more sophisticated, as we start making these things more complicated, sometimes it's harder to follow. So you almost have to sit down and kind of work it out on paper before you translate it into code, before you translate it into functions, in order to make sure it does what we want it to do. All right. So it's kind of, just kind of a pictorial representation of an indirect function. Now, error handling. So error handling is once again, this is something that gets done in higher level programming languages. So the idea is you can't always guarantee that, if you execute something, it will execute correctly or there won't be a problem. Case in point, you do a lookup in a table, there's not a matching value. All right. By default, what will happen is, in that sort of error, and that would be an error condition. In that error condition, what you will return, what you'll get in that cell will be an n/a. So that's a not available or not found. All right. Now, what we can do is we can use the if error function to do to basically take the results, whatever the execution of that function is. If I do it, if I'm doing a V search or an H search, and when I execute that, I can feed that result back into the error function, and it will, we can get it to send an alternative value. So let's look at an example here. All right. So we say if error. All right. So I have a lookup. So we look at the inside first. All right, so it's a VLOOKUP, and the way this would read is, we're going to look up at the value from B10. We're going to look at a name range called product list. If it succeeds, we take the value from column 4. All right. If it doesn't succeed, we return a false. All right. Now, what will happen is, so this will execute. The VLOOKUP will execute. The result of that will get passed back to the if error. All right, so it'll let this execute, and then it'll go back to the if error, and the if error will say, okay, what did I get back? All right, if I got a value back, if I got a true, take that result and multiply it times a cell number, a number in the cell. Otherwise, if I got an error, this is the error condition. So this is the true, this is the false. All right. So if this is the error, we will put a blank into that field. All right. So this is actually what we call in software terms, we call this a pattern. So this is kind of a construct for when you have a function and you want to put an error, you want to use an if error function to evaluate what the outcome of our function or our first function would be, and then do something about that. If we capture the error. So this is, like I said, this is a function and a kind of a capability we see in higher level languages. To be able to identify an error condition and then kind of do something about that. All right, so this is kind of an example of what an if error, kind of representation of this right here. All right. So we talked about a couple things. All right. So different functions, logicals, conjunctions, combinations of logicals, conditional aggregates, lookups, retrievals, error functions. All right. So let's look at our example. So it's one thing to look at this in the slides. It's another thing to actually see this in real life. So what I want to do is I want to look at our exercise 5. All right. And the functions in exercise 5, if we look at stuff here, what we get is, we start off with a client, a multi-tabbed data sheet. So we have a client registration. We have another tab for what we call event details, and then we have another tab for a kind of a summarization of the results. What we get back. So if you look, we've got a couple tables in here, a couple different types of tables. Registration goals. We have a tables for goals met. Kind of a value. Event promotion. On the client registration, we have a discount table that we need to go against, and then on the second tab, we have, I guess what we would call this, a pricing table. All right, so this is for each event, what the price of each event is. All right, so this is going to be, the event key. So this is what we would do a lookup on. All right, so this is the event name and the event type. And then this is the registration fee. All right, so what we would do is, so when we would do a VLOOKUP, we do a search of this, what we would do is we would give it this value right here. All right, so we would search this table with this value, or the cell that has that value in it. And then it will tell it, okay, if you find a match here, go to, bring back, return the result or what you find in the fourth cell. All right, or the fourth cell of the table, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So we've got a couple tables to work with in the logic here. All right. Okay, so so we're looking at this. We've got so we've got a couple of different things we need to do within this, and we're going to be using a combination of these different functions. So I'm actually going to kind of walk through the the structure of what these how we would construct these things, and they kind of align with this stuff, and then we can use that. You can use this to kind of go through it. So, like I said, this is not it takes a little bit of practice to get good at this. All right, but what I want to do is explain the construction of these things. And then you can kind of use that as a template as you're moving ahead with these things. All right. So what we need to do is, first thing we need to do is we need to figure out what the registration fee is. All right. So we're going to create a formula here. And there's a couple things there's a couple things we need to do about it. Number one is going to be, so the information, the data we need to populate these fields is on this second tab. All right, so we're going to, what it asks us to do is create a named range for this. All right, so we call it event detail. All right, that's our named range, and what we'll be plugging into our formulas here. All right. And then what we need to do is a couple things. So number one, we need to do a lookup of this table. Look up at this table and get the matching registration fee. All right. So as we look at this, this is the event ID here. We feed this into a VLOOKUP. All right, so we say G11. All right. Put a VLOOKUP in it. Feed it to event details. If we find the match in this table, we find it here, go to the fourth column and bring that over. All right. And if we don't do it, return a false. Okay, so this is what executes within this function here. All right, this is doing the lookup. We wrapper the lookup with an error check function. All right, so we do an if error. All right, and once again, it is, the way this reads is, here's the function, here's the first thing we're going to feed it, execute this, and then if it succeeds, if we get a successful result back, all right, we want to take that, we'll take the result and we'll multiply it times the total in party. All right, so where this comes into play, the logic is that, okay, this is the per unit. What we're going to get on this table right here is the per unit. So in order to get the full value, the extended value, we have to times that value times this right here. It's a little subtle, but you have to work. Otherwise, if it doesn't succeed, we put a blank in there, right? Because by default, what happens is if you do if you get a false value and you try to put the result of that function, the result of this function over here, if something doesn't get found, it will put an NA, like an error, an NA error into that cell. And what we want to do is we don't want to do that. We want to put a blank. So we want to suppress that. So as you can see, the result is when we execute that function, it's, pulls from this table, all right, evaluates the result, and if it found something, it multiplies, what we pulled out of the table times the number in the party. Otherwise, it punches a blank into it. Right? You see that? Hopefully you can kind of follow that logic. It's like I said, you must have to kind of write this stuff down, kind of figure out what you want to do and then map it out. So let's look at some of the other ones here. All right. So in this case here, what we need to do is we need to do the board member discount. All right, because the way, as we read the problem, when it says is, okay, if you are a board member, all right, depending upon the event, whatever the event is, you should get a discount of some value. All right, 5%, 7%, 10%, depending upon what the event is. All right, so we need to come up with a formula that does that. So I have another, find the example here. So let's go to this. And we'll walk through, I'll walk you through the logic of it. All right, so the logic on this is going to be, we'll go back to our original problem here. Okay, so the logic on this is, so what we need to do is we need to use a couple, we actually need to do a couple, use a bunch of functions here. A couple functions are going to come into play, all right? So one is, so to start off with, we want to do a lookup, all right? So we have to do the lookup of, the table here, all right? So actually we have to do the lookup of our, from our table, or from the event details. All right, so it's from our event details tab. Right, so we want to match. So we're going to match this event out of that table and bring back what's in column 3 in this case. So in the column 3 is going to be the event type. All right, so our first order of business is, okay, what's the event type? All right, so we'll pull the event type up. Here's the event ID. Here's what the matching type is. All right, that's our starting point. All right, so we've got the event type defined. Okay. And then, assuming, once we've got the type, we match. We'll take that result from that VLOOKUP and we'll match it into this table here. All right, so this is actually, so we could make that a named range. All right, it actually might be a little clearer if we were to use a named range. But this is do a match of the results of our table lookup into against this table, which is our board member discounts. All right. Okay, and then what it will do is it will tell us what the percentage is. All right, and then once we have that, we can take that data, and feed it into an index. It'll tell us what the process or what the value is within this. Okay. Now, at the outset, in order to do this, we start off with, is this person is this particular person a board member? So what we do is we do a check of the board member. So we check if D11 is equal to yes. If that's the case, we'll do this logic. We'll go through this, we'll do the lookup, pull from the one table, take that result, pull it from the other table, and put the result in there. Otherwise, we'll put a blank. Right? So if that is equal to yes, do all of this stuff right here. Everything up to here. We're actually through here, all the way through. Otherwise, don't do anything. Put a blank into the field. All right. So as I said, this looks, and it is. It's a fairly sophisticated bit of logic here with different steps and different pieces. All right. So what I want to do is I want to kind of walk through this so you can take a look at it, kind of deconstruct it, and get an idea of, so you have a reference example you can go back and kind of play with and kind of see how these things work. And I said, this takes practice. This takes a couple things. Like I said, things that can be used to simplify this is, by creating named ranges. And the thing to remember about named ranges, if I create a named range in a worksheet, it's accessible anywhere in the worksheet. So what happens is, if any place in the workbook. I create, by creating this, event details named range, I can reference it in this worksheet. I can reference it in that worksheet. I can do, if I have 100 worksheets, I can pull it up. So, something you might want to consider is as you're constructing or creating tables and doing stuff is, creating a name. Whenever you see a range, something you're going to be doing a table lookup on, give it a named range. Make it a named range, and then use that as your parameters. Okay. And then what you would do once we have that, what we can do is just do our grab. We can do our drag and drop to apply that formula to every cell. All right. That's our discount. So let's look at the next. So let's look at the next ones. All right. So we've got a couple. We have a couple other events here. Some other logic we have to work out on this. All right. So it's kind of as I said, this is pretty sophisticated little programming logic we would have to do within this. All right. So the next thing we need to do the event discount. All right, so let's see. So the event discount is going to be, so that's the registration fee. So we pull that formula in. So in that case, we'll go back, apply this. All right. All right. So let's look at the logic on this one. All right. So once again, another complicated multi-layer function. All right. So at the highest level, we're going to do an if error. So we know what the if error is about. So the if error is going to be, okay, if not, evaluate this function. If that's true, do a VLOOKUP looking for survey study. And if we have that, we'll match it up for 5%. Otherwise, if none of that's true, it'll return a blank. All right. So let's kind of walk through, kind of the inner logic on this one, because we're using an if not within this one. All right. So long as anything we do in here, so the logic for an event discount is the survey study every, of these 5 or 4 different types of events. The first 3 are eligible for a 5% discount. All right. If it's a survey study, you don't get that. All right. So the way we would look up at this would be, we will check to see, we do our G11, match it up against the table, so we'll get our event details. We'll pull the third value again, the event type. We'll pull the event type out, match it up against the value, of the event type here. And so long as it is not a survey, all right. So we can say, the way you could look at the logic would be, okay, you could say, if it's this, or if it's this, or if it's this, make it 5%. Or if you want to simplify it, you say, okay, if it's not a survey study, then it's going to be one of these 3, and you're getting it at the 5%. All right, so it does a lookup of the table. So as I said, you have to look at the, what you want to do is kind of study this, kind of stare at it for a while and kind of see how the functions are organized. So what will happen is it will evaluate this. So this will be executed first. The VLOOKUP will be, we'll look up for that value. And so long as, and the result of that VLOOKUP, it'll evaluate to say if it's not true. If it's not true, it'll make it 5%. It'll put a 5%. Otherwise, it'll put a blank. All right. And if it's not, and if it's a, the logic. Everybody study. Look up. So if it's not that, it'll put a blank in there as well. All right, so that's. I said you have to look at the, you have to kind of stare at it for a while and get a better, kind of see what we're trying to do with that. Okay. And then the third type of discount is going to be what we call, a guest discount. All right. So what is this guest discount about? Right. So the guest discount, or the friends discount. All right. So the friends discount. Let's pull this over. And this is once again more, kind of the sophisticated, a little more sophisticated in terms of the logic. For some reason, I'm having problems the first time I go to put this in, but okay, so that should be it now. Whoop. Hang on a second. Okay, good. All right, so let's look at this. Let's look at this formula. All right, so what this is going to say, the logic is, you have to be a board member. All right, you have to be a board member, and you have to have more than 3 people in your party. So H11, you got to be 3 greater than or equal to 3. So 3 is kind of the trigger point. All right. And if that is so let's see. Or, so we have an or, so we have a yes. Here it is, yeah. So the way we read this logic is, we will, so we will say if you are a board member and you bring 3 people in, or you're not a board member and you bring 5 people in, you get a discount. All right, so the key logic is, okay, are you a board member versus if you're not a board member. All right, if you're a board member and you got 3 people, you get an additional 3% discount. If you're not a board member, if you're not a member of the board, you have to bring, over 5 to get the additional discount. All right, and then if you get that, you'll get the discount applied. All right. So let's just kind of populate our formula here. Populate our cells with the formula. So we have it. All right. So like I said, this gets a little, this is where as you start mixing ands and ors in the logic. So as I say, what you want to do is you want to break it into, it's the logic into the component parts. and then kind of construct it, construct it piece by piece. So the first thing we want to do is we want to verify that we have a condition of, um, you know, of you're a board member and you have greater than 3. All right, that's our first one. Or you're not a board member, so you're not equal to yes, and you have greater than 5. All right. If that's the case, we put 3, we'll give a 3% discount. Otherwise, we put a blank. All right, so if we look at it that way, it starts making sense. So we want to read the logic and then kind of construct the construct our functions based on that. Just taking it really, really simple and making sure that's where the structure diagrams of the logic really can come in handy, because then you can kind of parse these things out and kind of get a picture view, and then you can use that to kind of create. Because just coming in and just trying to start typing and typing and typing, that can be a bit challenging. So finally, the last thing we got to do is they asked us to do the create the amount due. So what the amount due is going to be, it's going to be a combination of all of our discounts, against the registration fee. So let's pull that logic over. So this is pretty, as I said, this is pretty straight. This one is a little more straightforward than the other ones. I'm having this problem moving the formula to worksheet, so. All right, good. All right, so the way this logic will work is, to get the sum, what I want to do is I want to add these 3 together, which gives me my total discount. All right, so I sum J11 to L11. All right, and then what I want to do is, I want to do 1 minus that. All right, which will give me what my percentage will be, and then I will multiply that times the value. All right, so that will give me, so if I add these up, I'll have a total percent. If I do a 1, if I do 1 minus that, that'll give me what my percentage, and I multiply it, and I multiply that value times that, it'll give me what might do. If there was an error, so this is, this will be, kind of, you can just calculate this. Just, okay, this is going to be, your value of the registration fee times whatever our combined discount of these 3 are. All right, and the if error will do is it'll check to see, okay, if it succeeds, it'll put that value here, the result of that calculation. If it detects an error, it'll put a blank. It'll blank it out. So I don't think there's going to be any errors on this, but we'll see. Nope, there's an error. Okay. So there's like 2 of these. There's actually an error in there for some reason. All right. But that is, our, and we have to go back and take a look at what the errors are on that. But that's our calculation on that. All right. So what I've done is I've gone through, I've used the, we have a bunch of tables across these, across these different worksheets. Some of the ones on here. So one way you might simplify this is actually make this a named range as well. You make these things name ranges and you kind of work with it that way. All right, as opposed to having to put the exact cell addresses. But other than that, this is, so I've got a calculation for the registration fee, a calculation for a board member. So the first thing we do is we see if it's yes. If it's yes, we do all this stuff. Otherwise, we just put a blank in it. For the event discount, we check to see, we have to go to the event. We need to match up the event ID to the event type. And so long as it's not a survey study, we can give it another 5%. Right. And then if it's what we call a friend, in this case being you're a board member and you have at least 3 people, you get another 3%. If you're not a board member, but you have greater than 5 people, greater than or equal to 5, you also get the 3%. Otherwise, you get blank. All right, then we add the 3 values together and multiply it times our registration fee, and we get our answer. All right. So I said this is kind of this is a tricky stuff. That's why I wanted to go over this in detail, rather than just simply the slides. All right. So you can use this. You can kind of walk through this with the problem, the spreadsheet for our problem for problem 5, the problem for chapter 5 in the assignments. This will help you go through it. So I think there's some additional stuff. I think we need to do some additional stuff within the event analysis. Okay. But hopefully we can use the kind of what we've created here. Kind of the table lookups and that, and kind of getting a sense of how we construct this type of logic. All right. So, all right. Well, and that is what we need to know for chapter 5. Okay. Thanks.